Hi, let's look at a verse in James' epistle in chapter 4. It's a very simple verse. It's a quote from the Old Testament, and it says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That word resist is actually quite a strong word. It means to set in battle array. In other words, God has established himself forcefully against those that are proud. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why would God do that? What would prompt him to be so resistant to pride? Well, the primary reason is that anyone that's proud is someone that is lifting themselves up and establishing themselves over and above others. They're saying, I'm greater than so and so, I'm better than somebody else. And ultimately, they'll get to the point of saying, I'm better than God. And that is not possible because all of us are created beings. And God will know and remember the time when there was this most glorious angelic being that he had created. And that angelic being decided to, in his heart, to lift himself up into the throne of God. And of course, by doing so, he fell. And that angelic being we now know as the devil or Satan. And anyone that is lifting themselves up in pride is lifting themselves up ultimately against God and bringing themselves into a very dangerous position. And God will resist them strongly. And on the other side, you have, it says, but he gives grace to the humble. Anyone that humbles themselves before God, God will give grace to, God will reach out to them. And we read that verse humble, that word humble, and think, why is that so important? And it's hard for us to understand, but there's a verse in the Gospels where Jesus says, I am meek and lowly of heart. And you think, well, that's wonderful. And then later Jesus says to Philip, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In other words, Jesus is saying, as I am meek and lowly in heart, so is my Father. And pride is completely contrary to the character of God. And if you have pride, then you are completely against what God is and expects you to be. But anyone that's humble, anyone that recognizes that they are merely a created being and humbles themselves before God, God receives gracefully and is willing to give them whatever they need. There's a little verse later on in this same chapter where James gives an instruction and he says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. And there's two classic examples of this in the Bible. One is Daniel has his vision of the Lord before he appeared in flesh. And Daniel says that he fell on his face. He had no strength to lift himself up. And the Lord reaches down and touches him and raises him up. A very practical demonstration of what James has said. And then later we know the beginning of Revelation when John is talking about being in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And he hears a voice behind him. And he turns round and sees the risen Lord in all his glory. And he says he fell at his feet as one dead. He was so overcome by the glory that he was almost as though he was dead. And the remarkable thing in both of these situations is the Lord reaches down and lifts them up, exactly fulfilling physically what James is saying in this chapter. Now, he may not physically lift you up, but if you are on your face before God and humbling yourself before him, he will in some way or other lift you up. He will establish you, restore you, strengthen you, give you what you need to go on with the day or the week or the month. And particularly at this time, we all need strengthening. Now, it's not really the physical position that we're talking about here, being on your face. You maybe have some disability which would make that very difficult. And if you remember when we looked at the first chapter of John a little while ago, that God's sadness with his people people of Israel was, he says, they humble themselves, they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. You can be on your face before God and still full of pride. But if in your spirit you humble yourself before the living God, he will in his time lift you up. The safest place for a person to be is on their face before God. And I hope that that's the attitude that you have as often as you can. And know that it's a safe and secure and blessed place, because God is meeting someone with the same heart that he has, the same characteristic he has. And if you humble yourself before him, he will lift you up and carry you and strengthen you and take you on where he wants you to go. And I trust you do that regularly. And if you don't, now is the opportunity to come before him humbly and acknowledge that you are but a created being, and he is the one that has been and will be and always is. Be blessed.